Do you or should you have the right to your own life? Do you have the right to defend yourself? Do you have the right to own private property and then to defend that property from someone who wants to take it and steal from you? Do you have the right to defend your family and your loved ones? These are all questions that have already been answered by brilliant minds, but we have to keep asking them because we're under full frontal assault here in all the Western countries right now when it comes to the principles and foundational ideas and philosophies and thinking surrounding freedom and rights, the rights of man. And so it's timely to bring this up yet again. Got to keep going around this discussion over and over because liberty requires vigilance. The question is, where do you personally, listening to this right now, where do you stand on this? You need to know where you stand because you're being asked by your society, by your governments, by the forces that are moving right on in to Western countries that do not share our values whatsoever. And that question is going to be posed to you one way or another. We look at what's going on. I live in Canada, so there's been many incidences happening here that have brought this question up. Recently, there was a man in Ontario who was charged and fined for fighting back against a burglar that broke into his home at like 3 a.m. A fight ensued. Violence occurred. And the burglar got his ass kicked. This is just my basic understanding of the situation. The details escape me. But there's been many such instances, okay, where courts are siding more and more on the criminal side than they are the victim side. We've got guys running around in Vancouver, BC. There's been numerous public stabbing and slashing instances. There was just recently one on a bus where a guy starts cutting some guy's throat in the bus. Luckily, the guy survived, but his vocal cords are damaged. Just brutal. This stuff is happening all over the place. And yet people who actually defend their home, their life, their right to be living their lives unaffected by the incursions, the unwelcome incursions of others. They are the ones being criminalized. And the criminals, the perpetrators of crimes, are being let off scot-free. They're getting out on bail, slaps on the wrists. And so there isn't a precedent being set in Canada right now to discourage criminals. And that's very concerning, and it's one of the signs of the slow devolution of our society. We've seen this happen many times before. And so, yeah, we got to talk about this on a philosophical, metaphysical level. What that means is what do you believe about rights? There are some people that believe you have a right to the labor of other people. There's that side. There's the people that believe, no, your rights are not to be used. You can't be describing rights as something that you now have a lien on other people's productivity and labor. That is not a right. That might be a privilege that could be granted by the free will of somebody to you to say, hey, I'll support you without you producing anything. I'll go and produce. I'll apply my mind and my body to constructive purposes that end up yielding financial income or the product of my labor. I'll do that and you will not, but I am using my charitable goodwill out of my free will to make your life easier and give you a leg up and lend you a hand and all of that, which I'm all for. I'm all for charity and helping those in need, 100%. But should helping those in need be a coercive process? That's the sticky issue in the debate. This is just on one of the debates. It's not the focus of this video. That's another one. We'll leave that aside. But we now have to, if I'm going to say that I'm advocating as a freedom advocate, that you absolutely not only have a right to defend yourself, your property, and your loved ones against uninvited, unwelcomed incursions on that. I'm saying you have a moral obligation to do so that your society doesn't become fraught with bloody thieves and burglars and murderers and rapists, etc., that are just going to rape and render at their heart's content and call that freedom. I guess it is a kind of freedom, but it's not the freedom that I believe in. The freedom that I believe in means that your freedom stops where my freedom begins. So you cannot defile my freedom in pursuit of your own. And actually, we should define what a right even is, if we're going to talk about the fact that you have a right to defend yourself. Okay? And maybe just before we go that, there's a few other instances of this. Look at this young lass in Scotland. Scotland, the land of warriors and rebels, are now kowtowing to a political class that is completely leaving their children vulnerable to vicious criminal psychopaths. So we have this instance of this young girl who was videotaped trying to protect her friend or her sister, I'm not sure which one, from being sexually assaulted by somebody, and decides to pull out a big ass knife and an axe, a little hatchet, and be like, here and no further, mofo. And of course she gets arrested for carrying a blade, and then now that's the big debate. Well, she shouldn't be carrying knives. She's a young girl who is not responsible enough to wield blades. And the other side would say, no, buddy, all the men of Scotland have suddenly gone into a coma and are not defending the young, vulnerable children of their communities from violent gang rapes, grooming gangs, foreign invaders that have zero ambition of assimilation and 100% ambition of conquering the land that they have now fled to. And all of the men are just sitting back, and the cops are on the sides of the criminals. Everybody's afraid to be called a racist, so they don't arrest any of these criminals. And so these criminals run the streets now. This is the same case in a lot of places in Europe, thanks to suicidal empathy and insane government policies that all of your ancestors, I don't care where you come from, will be rolling over in their graves if they saw what is being permitted today in 2025. So now these young girls need to carry some frickin' steel with them, Hattori Hanzo steel, in order to go walk in the park. And this is now kicking off an entire rebellion. This one image of this girl holding up, with just terror on her face, holding up two blades in front of an adult pervert who wants to sexually harass them. And this is becoming a daily occurrence in Europe. Daily. I speak to people on the ground there. My news feed is full of it. You see it. They're even reporting it in the news now. It's just, they can't ignore it. It's everywhere. So that is another instance. And we could probably find more that are coming in now. In Canada, we'll switch back to Canada. It's appalling to me that the laws are such that it is actually illegal for me to use any sort of weapon to defend myself if someone breaks into my home. I will be criminally prosecuted. If somebody breaks into my house at 3 a.m. while my children are sleeping in their beds, and I have no idea what the intentions of this person is, and even if they were just breaking in to steal the ham sandwich in my fridge, they are not permitted to do that, and they are under now FAFO law. We're going to talk about FAFO law. It's my favorite law. If you want to ask Dave, what's your religion? FAFO is my religion. What's your governing philosophy in metaphysics? FAFO. And but either way, let's just, it doesn't matter. Anybody breaches the sealed barriers of my property and my home without my express knowledge and permission is now under FAFO jurisdiction. And if I am to be arrested, charged, and imprisoned for instituting FAFO in my house, I shall accept that, even though it's despicably wrong of the government to operate in that way, institute such a ridiculous policy that you cannot defend yourself. You must wait for the authorities to arrive. Well, the authorities aren't going to be there in time, buddy. You seen that? If you think the healthcare is bad, okay, try police response. It's not their fault. There's just they're understaffed. They don't have the resources. They're focusing on speeding tickets and fines and shit like that. So, you know, my love and respect for people in uniform that put that on every day and fight violent criminals and all of that, and the good men and women in the police services. Nothing but mad love and respect for you. But you have to admit, and I know you do because I've speak to many of you. In fact, most of you guys are the ones emailing me about this stuff and warning me about this stuff. So thank you for that. You know of what I speak. You know of what I speak, and you know I'm right. Why wouldn't you want your job to be easier for you? I'm doing your job for you by defending my property and dealing with that scumbag who deserves to be dealt with accordingly. And I follow the law of FAFO as well as I follow the natural law, that I'm only going to be using the force required to do what is necessary to defend my right to life, my children's right to life and protection from their father, who is their guardian in this world. You will not convince me, and there is no argument you can make that would justify the current government policy and police policy position on this in Canada. You know you're wrong. And so, just wanted to put that out there before we even discuss what rights are. For those of you who might not be aware, there's massive discussions and debates in philosophy and in history and in the political movements of the history of the West. And the West is unique in even having these debates. We're the only ones that do, by the way. So, you know, there you go. And we need to get into that as well. Because if I'm going to say you have the right to defend yourself, your property, and your loved ones, we need to know, well, where do rights derive? What is a right? We need another documentary film to go viral. What is a right? Well, here it is. There's a few views on it. There's three main views on rights. There's probably some spin-offs, but three main ones. One, this would be what Ayn Rand refers to as the mystics of muscle. This would be the idea that government is God, that rights are derived from society. Rights, so there's what's called social rights. Social rights. So rights are derived from the fact that you live in a society. And so therefore the society dictates what your rights as an individual are and what they are not, because they themselves are the arbitrary measure of from where we derive rights. is just the people in a country. That's where the rights come from. This is the socialist perspective. Then you have the mystics of spirit. This is the theocracy perspective, that, well, we should set up our societies under the governance of religion. And we will invoke a spiritual entity that we cannot prove exists, but we will, and everybody has their version of the said entity, okay? And so we will derive our rights from God or the gods. That's the source of human rights, says the mystic of spirit. And then there's another option that I'm going to argue for here, and I'll put a caveat. Whether you believe in a God, okay, or not, I want to make the argument that those two sides, the religious person and the non-religious person, that might argue a slightly different source for where rights are derived from, we can shake hands and throw off the nonsense coming from the mystics of muscle, the forces of government that are there trying to tell you, well, government is the source of rights. Because that's what it all, if you start saying society is the source of rights, what governs society? The government, which is supposed to be a reflection of the society. But what happens when society becomes possessed by a mind virus or develops mass formation psychosis and starts persecuting individuals, as we've seen just so many times in history? What happens then? So I just want to put that out there, that I'm not saying there's no such thing as a God or a divine power or a spiritual force that pervades the universe. You can still hold that belief, and you can still hold the belief that that is the source from where rights are derived, if you want. The only issue I'm going to show you is that that will not be convincing to your opponents, because they don't believe in that. Or they believe in that, but they believe in their version of that God force, of that God being. We're importing Islam right now, and this is super relevant, okay? Importing a culture and a religion. It's not a race, it's a set of ideas. And the thing about Islam is that it is both a religious and political and social and individual totalitarian government system. That's what it is. Many religions in the world will keep their paws off of the political, social side of things, and they will simply operate in the mystical world of religion and culture and everything else. But there are some that insist upon being intermingled with. And the difference in America was that there was not to be a union between church and state. It was to be separate, because we didn't want it. The West wanted to move away from the theocracies of the past that produced the Dark Ages, okay? So you can have your cake and eat it too, in a way, but I just wanted to put that caveat before I define this, because there is a third option for where rights are derived from that doesn't have to outright contradict the religious point of view, if you come from that point of view, but also would be a much more effective metaphysical argument against the totalitarian religious structures and theocracies and the socialist, communist, fascist government, forces of government as being the place where rights are derived from. You can settle them both with Rand's argument about rights. And other thinkers have put this out as well. That here's the source of rights. It's very simple. It's objectively observable and experiential to you. That your rights, so first of all, a right is simply a moral law applied to the social structure. So it's a social necessity. If you were living alone on the top of a mountain somewhere in some log cabin, and there were no other human beings on the earth or just around where you were, you wouldn't really need to discuss rights, because nobody would be infringing upon, no one would be in your vicinity to infringe upon your right of property, so, or your body, or your right to life. So you're the only one. So really, there's no need to have a discussion of rights if you are alone on a mountaintop or on an island somewhere, a deserted island. So rights only become a discussion when it's applied to a social framework. It's about relations between fellow human beings. That's what rights are all about. That's where the whole thing comes into play. Because it's about what is the limit to my freedom? Is there any limit? Well, the limit to your freedom if you're alone is, the limit to your freedom is that you're so free you might do something stupid and end up killing yourself by accident, right? And you're free to do that. But if you are now living in a society and you're part of civilization, you're part of a community, you're part of a culture, you're part of a family, you can't just do whatever the hell you want and expect there not to be any consequences. Okay, so that's the limit on your freedom, is the fact that you're to be respecting other people around you's freedom, so your freedom can't extend into their domain of freedom. So just want to put that layer first. Second layer, the source of rights. You can look at it as being simply derived from nature, and specifically man's nature, human's nature, your nature, my nature. Our nature means what is a human being, and what is our life, and what does our life require in order for us to survive and thrive in this world. There's the nature of a lion. That lion, its nature is that it must hunt and kill other animals in order to facilitate its survival. It defends and protects its right to go and tackle the gazelle and eat it by the fact that it's got the biggest claws around and it can defend its own right. So this is another component of rights that is there, which is that if you are going to declare the observable facts of reality that you have rights, just simply based on your nature as it being a necessity for your survival when you're living amongst other human beings running around, that fact alone is all you really need to go from. If you choose to extend that into some spiritual domain and bring in and deities and gods and everything, that's your free right to do that. But you don't need to. This is coming too from I think Matt Walsh and some of these more conservative Christian types are posting big time right now, because they're also seeing the same issue. And I'm glad they are. And I agree with what they're doing to call this out, because they're calling out the radical left, they're calling out the government and everything else for violating people's rights. So we're on the same team there. But where I depart is when they make statements that say the only way to view where rights are derived from is through the Christian lens or the religious lens, by the fact that it comes from some God somewhere. Now, the thing is even Rand, she was an atheist, but she had it's funny, when you read her description of consciousness and nature, she's not as far away from a mystic as you might think, even though that sounds contradictory. And even people that are big time Rand fans will be, why? But I don't want to digress into that. I just wanted to just bring it up quickly. You can do some more videos on that if you want. But she would even say, and she said in the statements, and I'll put the quotes below so you can check it out, that whether you believe your rights are derived from God or nature, basically, we're on the same playing field here. We're having the same, very similar discussion. And that she just describes and argues for the fact that there's an advantage in the argument. despite your personal belief system. There's an advantage in the argument on the stage of philosophy and politics by arguing for the fact that your rights are derived from your own nature and your own needs and goals as a human being. You could look at this, you could go into a whole philosophical breakdown of what that even means. Basically, you could just say that, well, objectively, we don't have to argue the origin of life, but we know life exists because here we are living it. And we also know death is a result of either old age, the clock run out, or some sort of accident that took place, or someone violating your rights and actually going out of their way to end your life. So the first right must be the right to life. You didn't invent life. You didn't create life. You don't get to end it. That is not your decision. That's the idea. And the only exception would be in self-defense. That would be the only exception in the moral law. So this is about morals. This is philosophy here, okay? So morals are about what is good and bad for you to do that helps you facilitate your survival. That's on an individual level. And then when, again, we're taking you away from the lonely mountain scenario and bringing you into a society where you're surrounded by other people who also have those rights, now the morality extends to the other. And now your individual morality is based on what is right and fit for you to facilitate your survival and thriving in this life. And now you also must consider the right for others to live and thrive in their lives. And that is the beginning of the discussion of morality. Where it all derives from at the end, the very beginning of all that, that is up to you to figure out. It's a mystery. But just to explain this, listen, we need to explain this, because I nobody explained this to me forever. I had to go and seek it out and read and learn, and then see what fits the best. But so I go with more of a natural law argument, just to keep it simple. Someone might say, "Oh, my rights are derived from the Creator." Fine. I just say, "Nah, let's just go with natural law. It's all you need." That way, you don't need to exclude people in your society who don't have your religious beliefs. And that's why we don't want a theocracy, because a theocracy demands conformity. It doesn't promote free thinking. It doesn't promote rebelling against the edicts of that religious cult that's in power. So that's the issue. And if you want to have a truly free society, which is what the goal of the West was, you need to remove the religious component from politics. You must allow for religious freedom. However, now as we're running headfirst into a totalitarian set of ideas such as Islam and wokeism, which is now a new religion that came in as the vacuum was created once the West walked away from traditional religion. An appropriate thing has not replaced it, and so here we are making up all kinds of wacky cults and whatever, but I digress. Now that we're bumping up against these other sets of ideas, and the reality is setting in about what the implications are going to be if we continue down this road, we are now having to ask this question about rights even deeper. And so you don't want a system to be governing your life that does not share that view, that whether you look at it as God as being, or some divine force as being the arbiter of your rights, or whether you look at it as just nature, your needs and requirements in life are reason enough to grant rights. The objective fact that you have no right to harm another and they have no right to harm you, that's enough for the origin of rights in this argument. And your rights must be congruent with your nature and what is required for you to survive. So your mind is a requirement for your survival. Your ability to think and reason is a requirement for you to survive. If you go out into nature and you do not use your thinking and reasoning and your logic, you will not survive. If you live in an irrational state of mind and you adopt an irrational opinion and an irrational worldview, the only way that survives is if you're protected in some sort of bubble like society, like an advanced civilization that guards you while you sleep and provides you everything you need. You can then live in a deranged state of contradictions, misunderstandings, ignorance, and irrationality, because there's an artificial buffer that is protecting you from what otherwise nature would do to you in that situation. Nature does not permit you, in a natural setting, nature does not permit you to be irrational. Let me say that again. Natural law, the law of nature, wherever it came from, however it's here, it's just observable and experiential. It does not permit you to live in an irrational state. You could set up a nanny state. You could set up a home where your children could be living in an irrational way of seeing the world because they're young and they're still developing, and that's why they require parents, and that's why they require a home. They're dependent on you. And that's the only socialism I'll personally tolerate, is the home environment. But the home environment is a place where you can raise and develop the minds and the reason and the logic and the intuition and the creativity of your children's mind through proper education and instruction and guidance. You can raise them into individuals. That's what maturing is. That's what coming of age is. That's what the process of education is. And you are to teach your children. You can get away with those temper tantrums and that irrational thinking process in the home, because I'm here protecting you from the consequences that nature will befall upon you should you behave that way outside of my protection. But the minute you grow up and have to leave my protection, you will learn very quickly that nature does not permit irrationality. And the more our society creates a bubble-wrapped situation to pretend that we can permit irrationality and expect survival and thriving, that is an illusion. Because if society falls, if the power grid goes down, that's all that would take. I think even if just the internet goes down, we're in Mad Max scenario pretty quickly, given the current generations, all right, and where they're at. But yeah, power goes out, atomic blast goes off somewhere, civilization down, power grid down, bubble-wrapped world gone, the illusion of security gone, left to your own devices. Who are going to survive that situation? Those that do not permit the irrational. Who are going to not survive? The irrational. It's basic. This is just reality, okay? It's these kinds of things that brought about the discussion of rights and even the idea of rights in the human mind. And don't forget that the idea of rights and individual rights were already thought up before electricity was invented. So, we've already understood this from observing the mystery of nature and how it operates. So, just to give you the background, these are the things that really help me understand this on a bigger level. I'm a 40,000 foot view person. I have trouble sometimes with the close-up details of certain things, but I understand things much better when I can understand the why and the how and the big picture of something. So forgive me if I go on some of these long digressions. I just feel like this is important context. That's what we're really trying to put in here. We need to, if you're going to have the debate, which our time is forcing you to have this debate, okay? The time we live in, you are forced to be a part of this debate, whether you like it or not. So you better arm yourself with as much information and context about this debate as possible, especially if you are a freedom advocate. If you're not a freedom advocate, you're living in the irrational and you're living in a bubble-wrapped illusion that could pop any moment. So think of nature in its natural setting. Think of you as a human being in your natural setting, outside of the Starbucks world, the IMAX 3D, social media, scrolling world, in nature. That's where the context of rights begins. It's rooted in your nature because your nature is nature. Do you get that? I go with Schelling on this. Nature is visible spirit. That's one end of the spectrum. Spirit is invisible nature. That's the other spectrum. You don't really need much more to understand this. And by the way, Schelling also wrote on the freedom of man and had some interesting things to say, worth checking out. Michael Tessarian has a whole website called schellingzone.com, and he's got it all there for those interested in his thoughts. But I'm coming from the Rand perspective here because I think it's the best. I also favor the American system over most of the rest, especially seeing what's happened in my country in Canada and how feeble our understanding of these philosophical debates really is. And it's that is causing Canada to fail. It's not just corrupt bureaucrats and government. It's a flawed premise. The premise of the way Canada thinks about rights is flawed. That's why your rights are being violated more and more. That's why the rights of criminals are being permitted more and more, and the rights of victims of criminals being reduced. Rand was also a prophet in a way, where she predicted what a failing society and a failing civilization would look like, and it might have something to do with the fact that we have an open track record of all the great civilizations and empires and countries and nations at our disposal to analyze, and we can compare and contrast to what's happening right now. It doesn't take a crystal ball. It doesn't take some divine prophet to be able to predict where a train is going while it's on train tracks. If you can see the tracks, you can see the train is on the tracks, you know where the train is going. It doesn't take mysticism to figure out. And she said, the sign, and all the signs she gives, and that brilliant statement she made about what causes your society to be doomed, what dooms your society. Canada's going through the stages right now. All the Western countries are going through the stages right now. And I'm overjoyed to see people fighting back, but it isn't enough right now. So we've got, where do your rights derive from? This is you don't even have to agree with what I'm saying. I'm just giving you the arguments, okay, that you can make. What do you think is the most powerful argument when you're speaking to an atheist radical communist that wants to convince you and your entire society that we should eliminate all belief in any divine force? We should make government and society the god of men. And we should chain every individual to that society and basically run a totalitarian system to produce something that has never been producible, ever, no matter how many times they try, which is equality. We'll force equality into being. What argument is going to be more powerful? You looking at them and saying, my rights are derived from God and the Bible and my holy book. If they're just going to laugh in your face and go, yeah, you're a nutbag. You believe a bunch of fairy tales. So that argument won't suffice against them. Even if you believe they're wrong and you're right in that scenario, and maybe you are, it doesn't matter. It's not effective. It's falling upon deaf ears. So, you want to make an effective argument that they can't debunk. It's impossible. You go with nature, natural law, man's nature, man's requirement for survival. That's all you need when you're talking rights. And rights only apply in a social setting with other people, when you're talking about relations between other people. And because I need my mind in order to survive, to facilitate my survival, that's why I need freedom to think. I need the freedom to go into nature and procure my means of survival. I have that right because it is a requirement that nature and life puts upon me in order for me to survive. So no government has the ability, there's no argument you can make to say, well, that government can violate natural law. Are you saying government can violate the laws of physics? You see what I mean? We're getting into laws of physics now. We don't have to get into pie in the sky, religious mumbo jumbo to define this. You can if you want. You can still believe in that if you want, but you don't need it. It's not effective in this debate. Give them something they can't refute, because they can just refute and say, yeah, well, you believe that. The guy up the road believes in a different God and his laws. Like, you've got Islam coming in, making that argument. All right, to have a global caliphate comes from our God. How are you going to argue that? They believe in that. They're working on that. They're just not like the polite Jehovah's Witnesses that are coming around that it might be a bit annoying about trying to recruit you into their MLM, but they're not pointing a gun at your head or putting a sword to your neck and saying, convert or die, asshole. That's the difference. At least the Jehovah's Witnesses will believe in your freedom to say no to them. Islam doesn't believe in that. They just don't believe in that. It's not part of their canon. It's not part of their belief system. And then you take that, and then there's other extreme forms of this religious view of, well, my right comes from my God. Well, but then now we have to go, well, whose God is supreme? And now we have all the religious wars of all of history that are just going to continue. You see the problem with this argument? Even if you want to believe in yours and say yours is the right and your God's the best, go ahead. But it's not the argument to be made against these forces that we're up against, my friends. So I just wanted to put that yes, obviously you have a right. You have a right to your own life. You have a right to life. That's why in America it was, you have a right to life. That was first. You have the freedom to think. In order to think, you have to speak. In order to speak, you have to think. So, hence, the birth on a philosophical, metaphysical level, first time ever in history, enshrined in an actual document, in an actual belief system, in an actual legal system. And yeah, it comes to the Magna Carta, and that was the positive side of the British Empire and everything, right? Okay, we got that. We got the origin of the idea. But the idea, before it was put into the political world, first came out of philosophy. So you got to start with the premise of the arguments. That's what philosophy is. It's arguing for metaphysics, arguing for ideas, arguing for foundational principles and concepts that we can build actual tangible systems upon. And the experiment will run on and on and on. And maybe one day we'll figure out what the best balance of all of it is. But until then, this is more than sufficient. The big problem is with the religious argument about rights is now you're up against a whole other battlefield of whose holy book, whose whose interpretation of the words of the divine, who's got the prophets, who's got the best prophets, who's got the best priesthoods to determine the will of the gods for us mortals. And that will be the endless wars forever that we will go upon, and we'll never settle it as a society. And we will never be able to be robust enough in stopping both the mystics of muscle and the mystics of spirit from putting us into the dark ages. So the better, smarter, more strategic argument to make is natural law. And all you're going to do, think about it, even if you're the religious type that said, no, it comes from God, fine. All I'm saying is that you just got to back it up one step. And then you could add the final step in your own personal belief system that says, well, that final step is God. God created the natural law and created the natural order of things in nature. And therefore, if you're to say that your rights are derived from that natural, your nature and nature itself, then it's all coming from God. So you see how we can still be friends? But the other side can't be friends because they don't want individual rights of any kind because they don't believe in it. They don't believe it exists. They're delusional. They believe everything comes from society. It comes from groups of people. Well, what is a society but just individuals coming together to live together? You're still individual. The government officials don't have any more rights than an average citizen who's going to vote or not vote for that government official. There's no such thing as group rights because there's no groups. There's only individuals that maybe agree on something. That doesn't equate to a right. Your rights don't extend to you saying, well, I am either not willing or able to procure my own survival, so therefore I must depend upon everybody else. Well, all you're doing is you're giving yourself a license to be a parasite upon the work and the rights of others to produce for their own survival. And when you make this argument, everybody thinks you're immediately saying, well, we shouldn't help the downtrodden and the poor. No. I'm just saying that your recipe of weaponizing government and this process of rights and conflating things and putting false premises and non-arguments forward to justify theft and parasitism as a way of achieving some sort of altruism, I'm just saying that your premise is wrong and your solution is wrong. I want to solve the problem of poverty and people that need a helping hand and all of that. I want to solve that problem as well. I want to help those in need as well. But I want to do it of my own free volition. I don't want to be coerced and forced into it by a bunch of people that are using that whole scheme of setting up those government programs as such to actually violate the rights of you as an individual by coercing you to give away not just a little bit of your income, a substantial, if not the majority of your income, which is a representation of the value that you produce by going into nature and turning nothing into something of value. Because the whole point is you have to turn yourself into something of value, which is, another requirement for your survival. The whole point of those corrupt socialist systems is that they are violating your right in order to argue for the right of somebody that doesn't exist. The right doesn't exist to say, I have a lease on your life because I have a need. Well, eliminate the need. And if you can't do it, and you definitely aren't going to use coercion and force to eliminate the need. You know what I mean? So you have to use your mind, your will to eliminate that need. And if others around you are charitable enough and wanting to help, absolutely go with them. And God be with them. They may help you at their own virtue, their own charity. That's their prerogative. No government No group of people has the right to take your rights in order to force you to defend the ones they just made up that don't derive from nature. Nature, if you didn't have a society, if you didn't have a civilization, and you were, again, living, if man was back in a primitive state, nature does not agree with the fact that you have a right to healthcare. You don't have a right to healthcare. You have a right to try to survive, and nature is going to throw everything in the kitchen sink at you to see if you can get through it. So these are some very complex debates. I'm just summarizing it as I'm driving here, so I hope I'm not jumping around too much on you. But the whole point of the discussion on rights is to say, here's what I think is the best argument to make for the fact that, yes, you have a right to defend yourself, because defending yourself and your property. So that's, this is another thing I got to say before we jump into that. Property. That's another requirement for your survival. You need a place to live, to sleep, to eat. You need privacy. These are human needs. Territorial imperative. Every creature alive carves out some property and defends it. Carves out some territory and defends it, because it needs that territory in order to raise children, in order to live efficiently enough so you can sleep, you can eat, you can think, so that you can better go out and get the resources and apply your mind to facilitate your survival. You need a property. So for them to say you don't get private property, that means they own you. They own you. So if you believe in freedom, you absolutely believe in private property. And if you believe in private property, the first private property that you have the right to defend is your body. Your body is your property. You could say, well, it's God's property. Fine, whatever you want to call it, but you are in charge of it. You are responsible for it. If you treat it badly, your survival will be threatened. If you treat it properly, your survival will be enhanced. Very simple. You can't treat your body improperly and then put a lease on everybody and say, I deserve the right to free healthcare. No, you don't. No, you don't. Your right is connected to your nature and what is best for your survival. And if you are working against your own survival, you don't get to put a mortgage on other people to force them and to extract resources from them to create that fake bubble wrapped reality that doesn't exist in actual nature, to play pretend with you that you have a right to free healthcare. You don't have a right to free education either. You don't have that right. That is not a right. You could say that's a goal we would love to achieve one day. That'd be nice if we were so abundantly wealthy that we could just have everybody have free everything, you know? That would be nice, but it's not part of this. It's not part of that natural law. So when I'm talking rights, I'm talking about the primal ones. You have the right to your own life. That is a right. I don't care what aisle you're on politically, how you see these issues. You must never cede that right under any circumstances. That's the right they want to take from you, because they don't want you to live your own life. They want you to work in their machine towards their interests, towards their goals, towards their benefit. These totalitarians that live amongst us everywhere. And you better become empowered with the arguments that are in your favor to fight for your freedom and your rights. And these are the most powerful ones. It shuts them all down. They do not have a leg to stand on. They're living in a false, fake, delusional reality. And they don't care that it's not accurate. They're still coming after your right. And you also can't become a victim either, just because there's predatory forces going around in the world. You must be the one that defends your right. You must be the one that advocates for your right. You must be the one that understands and knows how to argue for your right. That's my take. So, you have the freedom to defend yourself, your property, and your loved ones. I hope I've given you a few good arguments, or at least some new context to help you understand where rights and the whole thing even comes from. Get into it. Just study it. You don't have to agree with everything I'm saying about it. Just go read about it. Learn about where all these things come from. Where do we even come up with this? And learn where the arguments are demonstrable, provable, objectively observable, and where they are not, where they are made up. You'll be able to determine the truth from the lies. Because remember, truth and freedom go well together. Truth and freedom. Those two dipping sauces, they just go so well together. Lies and slavery, they also go very well together. They don't go down well, but they pair well. And that's really what this is. In the end, there is no left versus right. There is only freedom versus slavery.